Hello. Welcome to Great Conversations at Washington State University. My name is David J. Leonard. I'm a professor and chair in the Department of Critical Culture, Gender, and Race Studies. Today we are joined by Alondra Nelson, who's an associate professor of Sociology and Gender Studies at Columbia University. Welcome.
Good morning. Good morning.
Thanks for being here. So talk to us about your research, because your research brings together a variety of topics, whether it be medical science, gender, race, and social inequality, as well as history. So talk to us about how you bring these topics together.
I bring the topics together by looking at specific sites. So in general, my work is interested in kind of try to excavate kind of untold stories of African Americans' experiences with science and technology and medicine. And so the topics are site specific, and when you choose a site that's not been written about, you have to use all of these different kinds of methodologies and approaches. So the site and the question of the site that I'm looking at, and right now I'm working on genetic ancestry testing, kind of dictates what the method is, right? So the method for the genetic ancestry testing project, which is called the Social Life of DNA, started out as an ethnographic project because people were talking a lot, starting in 2002 and 2003, about Black communities using these tests to trace their roots back to Africa. But there was no literature, there was no magazine articles, there were no Skip Gates documentaries, and so in that case what you have to do is do ethnographic work. You have to find the people who are the early adapters and just talk to them. So that project starts out ethnographic, and then there's some, then it becomes historical in some regards, sort of thinking about why over time have Black communities done genealogy, and then I'm allowed to sort of think about gender critique and think about the way that the family and kinship is supposed to tell us something about who we are, and the way that often stereotypical ways of thinking about mothers and fathers, you know, from motherland to patrilineage, sort of figure in how we think about genealogy and root seeking. The project then went on to, as I was interviewing people, you know, you can't help but notice at these genealogy conventions and clubs that they're mostly African American women. They're in fact mostly African American club women who would have been club women in the early 20th century. So, you know, they're they're AKs and deltas. They are, you know, often have master's degrees, you know, who've been school principals, they've worked for the federal government, so very well off, you know, upper middle class African American women who are very integrated into their communities doing that kind of work. And so the gender analysis and critique really sort of came out of knowing more about the site. So that's kind of how that project came to be, and that project is historical. There's some media analysis and also ethnographic.
So does it really evolve as you're working and as things are happening?
Yeah, sure. So the thing about working on something that's happening, right? So I start working on it in 2003 when the company African Ancestry emerges, and then now it's, you know, a very important company and has been involved in lots of interesting kind of celebrity, Black celebrity kind of DNA reveals. So, I mean, I think that's part of the ethnographic method, though, is that the project sort of you follow, and, you know, why I call the project the Social Life of DNA is that I take very seriously Arjun Appadurai's sort of mandate in his book, The Social Life of Things, that you kind of follow the object in the sites where it goes, right? And so the evolution for me was sort of following these tests that come from this company and seeing what people do with them in these various kinds of political sites. So yeah, it's very much been an evolution, but it's been an evolution that's been about following people and following the various kind of meaning-making locations into which these tests are placed.
So do you see a connection between this work and your past work on Black Panthers and health politics?
Absolutely. I mean, all of my work is really about thinking about science. So, you know, when we were in graduate school, right, there was a lot of literature on kind of science making race from above, right? So there were books about scientific racism, there were books about, you know, there was like Ian Lopez Haney's White by Law, so race being made in the law, race being made in all of these kind of institutional and kind of macro structural sites, right? And so in each of these instances, I thought thought, what were people doing on the ground, right? I study social movements. I'm interested in activism. I'm interested in just the lives of local communities. And, I found that, so on the one hand, we know that law, science, medicine are places where ideas about race are made, but what do we know about how communities have responded to them, challenged these, talked about them, taken up these ideas or not? And so that's, to me, where all of this work intersects. So for example, we have, going back to the 1850 scientific racism, these ideas about the great chain of being and where all of the kind of races fall in this hierarchy of talent and skill and IQ and civilization. And we have similar, through the work of the historian Marc A, a similar kind of great chain of being, but for technology. So that colonial European colonizers sort of said, well, the Chinese are great with technology and their technology is more interesting and useful to us than the Africans. And so that there's a way in which science and technology have always been these kind of places where ideas about race were made and sort of racial stratification was produced. And so even though they're very, biomedical research in the 21st century is very different from, gunpowder in 1600 in China, there's a way in which they've been used as, in Michael Adis's phrase, as the measure of men, and we'd say women now, right? But they've been this sort of way, of creating hierarchy and inequality in society, a kind of justification for it. So although the Black Panthers health activism seems very different from genetic ancestry testing, seems very different from, the work I did on Afrofuturism, to me, they're really all about this sort of intersection of a history of race making from the top and via science and medicine and technology and how communities have responded to them.
So how did for those who haven't read your brilliant book, how did the Panthers respond to health inequalities in terms of the way in which science operated in its relationship to racism, and if you could talk also a little bit about the Black Panthers in Washington, in terms of the work that they did.
Yeah, so I argue that the Panthers work in a long tradition of Black health activism that's pretty much unarticulated, right? People have done different projects in different places, like my colleague Sam Roberts writes about tuberculosis in Baltimore in the mid-20th century, but there's still not work that's really taken together that this has been an important part of the Black freedom tradition, this work around health inequality. So the Black Panther Party, I argue, used three strategies: institution building, and inclusion or integration, which is they wanted to be included in the health mainstream on their own terms, and also what I call the politics of knowledge. So two of those are kind of practical. The first two, so inclusion and institution building, are about getting people basic healthcare, responding to the profound neglect to access to basic healthcare needs, right? And part of that is just creating spaces that didn't exist before, creating spaces that are, and for the Panthers, more humane, more hospitable, that are more, I think today, in today's language, we'd say more culturally competent, right? Like that really understood the communities and were locally based, so that people could walk around the corner or walk down the street and see someone with a question about healthcare issues, right? And the politics of knowledge piece is more where we see them explicitly engaging the ways in which ideas about Black bodies in medicine could be explicitly racist, and that in ways in which that's the work of what biomedicine is doing, arguably. And so in this case, you see the Panthers, and this is where it links up with Henrietta Lacks a bit, sort of responding to attempts by scientists at UCLA in the early 1970s to do biomedical research on Black and brown, particularly young men and boys, on the assumption, based on the hypothesis, that the young men, Black and brown boys, were violent because they had their biology made them violent, right? And so it would have been interesting even if the Panthers had said, like, this is bad, but they were creating a different theory of violence. So they actually tried to intervene in the funding streams that were coming from the California state legislature. They offered to the California state legislature another kind of theory of why violence exists in American society, which is about, colonialism, racial oppression, class inequality, and these sorts of things. So to me, that's actually quite profound. And the Panthers are extraordinary in a lot of ways, but that case for me suggests that there's lots of other examples of Black communities responding to the ways in which they were disproportionately overexposed to medical intervention.
So did you do any research on, or through your research, did you come to any historiography about the Panthers in Seattle?
Yes. So the Panthers in Seattle are interesting with regard to healthcare. So as you probably know, they're started by the Dixon brothers. They go to they travel to Oakland for a funeral of a member of the party there, and they're very much taken with the Black Panther Party and get permission to start a chapter. But they had already been doing activism in Seattle. They were involved in Black student unions, and there was I can't remember the name of the high school, but the sort of high school that was more like was kind of where most of the Black students attended at that time. Franklin High School. So they were already involved in activism there. So it wasn't like, so it was creating a chapter of the party here was an extension of work that they were already interested in Seattle. And this chapter is interesting because for lots of reasons. I mean, they epitomize in some ways the Black Panther Party as a West Coast organization, I think. I mean, so it's easy to think about the Black Panther Party as being this Black separatist militant organization in a quite unsophisticated way, but to pull off health clinics and a Black Panther chapter in the Northwest, where you have significant Latino, Asian American, and white populations that are probably bigger than the African American population, means that you have to have a profound sense of interracial coalition building and creating all of these lots of solidarity in the work that they're doing. And Seattle really kind of epitomizes this. So the chapter had, the members were Black, the rank and file, the leadership was Black, but they couldn't have pulled off any of the things that they pulled off without the work that they did with other people. And in fact, I think that the headquarters for the office was maybe donated by a white man in Seattle who was working with them, who either gave them the building or rented the building to them for not a lot of money. So the Seattle story is one of the more important stories for the healthcare piece because it's a story of continuation. So they start here in the late 1960s. It's one of the first clinics in the party. So by 1970, the party headquarters, Bobby Seale, sort of sends down a mandate that says to be a Black Panther Party, you have to have a health clinic. But there were a few cities that had them before this mandate comes down, and Seattle was one of those. And the clinic is started, among other people, by a woman named Carolyn Downs and her partner at the time, which is a man named Arthur Harrison, and Dixon Brothers and some other rank and file members of the party. And Carolyn Downs gets cervical cancer and dies within sort of a year and a half of the clinic starting. So she dies as a very young woman, and but the work that she did with the clinic sort of remains, and it remained as a clinic for several more years in Seattle. And then today in Seattle, there's a sliding scale clinic called the Carolyn Downs Family Medical Center that's named in her memory. That's located in the same little pocket neighborhood in Seattle where the Black Panther Party headquarters and clinic was located, and which testifies to, these are, again, it's a multicultural sliding scale clinic, NGO, that when you walk into the clinic, puts up front and center the fact that they're working and the legacy of the Black Panther Party. They've named the clinic for Carolyn Downs, and there's a kind of decree, there's a plaque in the clinic when you walk in that says that they're continuing the work of the party. So it's not a party clinic to the extent that there are members of the 60-year-old members of the Black Panther Party working in the clinic necessarily, but it's very much a material manifestation of this institution building strategy that the Panthers had that persists today.
What do you think the importance is of seeing that lineage that so often, whether it be because we're talking about social movements as in relationship to game theory, that it has a beginning and an end, or just the narrative that talks about the rise and fall of movements, and that focuses on repression, which was real, and had dire consequences for individuals, for organizations. But what do you think that the importance of recognizing these institutions that are still providing material things, healthcare, job training, what's the importance of seeing that in relationship to this larger history of struggle?
I think the sort of conceptually, you're hitting on it a little bit, the big I think, takeaway is this idea of social movement spillover that sociologists talk about. So this sort of sense that movements may come and go, they might rise and fall, but they're actually always proliferating more struggle, more contestation, and more movements. And they look at like all different sorts of ways. So sometimes it's a strategy that goes from, you know, the Weathermen to, you know, I don't know, some contemporary group, or strategy that goes from the women's health movement to Greenpeace. Or sometimes it's a strategy like institution building that goes from the Panthers to people who are working today. And, you know, a really profound moment of healthcare neglect and inequality, you know, for the same things that the Panthers were working for. So that's one element of it. But I think more specific to the Panther case is it clues us into the fact that the repression of the Panthers was a lot about guns and about putting black bodies in jail, but it was also about a repression of an accurate historical narrative, right? So that the counterintelligence program of the FBI, COINTELPRO, effectively shut down chapters, shut down lives, ended lives fatally, but also shut down collective memory, both on the left and on the right, with regards to who the Panthers were, right? And so, you know, so I started working on the Panther book in graduate school as my dissertation, and as I did the dissertation and was revising the manuscript, I mean, people would look at me like I was out of my mind when I said, you know, I write on the Black Panthers' health activism. I mean, people who were on the streets in '68, people who were right-wingers, like, both looked at me with the same, like, face. Like, you know, like, you're crazy, or, you know, this doesn't compute. It was a kind of this doesn't compute, curious kind of face. And I think that really goes to the way that the counterintelligence program was able to shape media narratives about the Black Panther Party, even among those who would have been supportive of their legacy. So I think that the Seattle story is important because it's a material place, as you suggest, right? That insists on keeping that linkage clear, insists on keeping that genealogy and that lineage clear, even as we want to be, you know, careful about being terribly true to genealogy. But it makes it explicit. I mean, you can't say like, no, they didn't do this, or how could they have done this, or it's impossible that they did that, because it's here, this building, this face, this, you know, this decree, these words, these people, right? Yeah.
So, talk to us about. So you start your book. Talking about the healthcare debate and the Affordable Care Act. So talk to us about what lessons we can learn from the history of the Panthers and health activism that you lay out in Body and Soul. What are the lessons for that discussion about the Affordable Care Act? And I also am curious how we can talk about them together when you have the kind of state providing health care and the Panthers basically articulating this vision where the state has failed in providing what is a guaranteed human right, as well as a right of citizenry. Right. And so we have is this the legacy? Is the fight has gone into the state, or are they working together? So.
Well, I mean, as your question suggests, it's pretty complicated, right? So, I mean, I think, you know, one thing is for sure that the things that the Panthers were asking for, which was, you know, free, available healthcare access, right, for all people, still was unaccomplished in 2011, right? Still was unaccomplished by the time we get to Obamacare. And what happens is, as we see, you know, this is like Guinier and Torres talking about the miner's canary. It's like what was happening in 1970 with the Black Panther Party and black communities that didn't have healthcare access became a problem that burgeoned and became a problem of the white middle class, right? And so, it was curious and interesting for me to sort of hear some of the frames that were put around Obamacare, because they were the frames that health radicals were using in the 1970s. The Black Panther Party, Barbara and John Ehrenreich and their organization Health PAC, you know, health for people's bodies, not for profit. That's the line that a lot of people were using, you know, 2 years ago to try to push Obamacare through, right? So, but what's different, you know, and this maybe goes to your question about the state a little bit, is, and what the Panthers remind us, that fundamentally won't be changed until we have a different kind of system, economic system, is that insurance doesn't guarantee health care, right? So Obamacare is effectively, it's not a state system. It's a private insurance system, and it's a boon for the insurance companies. And as someone who cares about health inequality, I so much prefer that we have it than that we don't have it. But there's a lot that's undone. So there's a wonderful moment, wonderful poignant moment, not wonderful in a positive sense, and that Joan Didion reminds us of in her book The White Album, and that people don't write about so much because it's it's considered one of Didion's more famous books. It's considered her most kind of clarion Didion-esque writing. But part of what she's writing about in the chapter called The White Album is about Huey Newton being arrested in October 1967 for this shootout with Oakland police officers, in which one officer dies and both Newton and another officer are wounded. And this is from the court. She takes this from the trial transcripts for Newton, and he's in Kaiser Hospital, and he's shackled basically to a gurney. So this is what a hospital looks like if you're a black working class man, right? It looks like you're shackled, right? And it also is redolent of Dorothy Roberts writing about black women, right, in the 80s, suspected of being crack mothers, sort of shackled to hospital beds, right? So this is a site in which hospitals have been sites, punitive sites of surveillance for black people in particular. So the court transcript is of the nurse who's there at the Kaiser Hospital, and she's saying, well, he's this guy, Newton, this Negro man, he's asking me for, to be admitted to the hospital, and I say, are you a Kaiser? And she's asking him, are you a member of the Kaiser insurance plan, which is a very early HMO, right? And he says, lady, I'm shot in the stomach, I'm bleeding, I'm in agony, yes, I'm a Kaiser, but, get me some help. And she's like, well, if you don't have your insurance card, I can't help you. So they kind of go this back and forth. They do this dance, and Didion writes like all of us. She's like, I initially assumed that that he didn't have healthcare insurance and he was just a man kind of out of the system. Newton was a member of the Kaiser insurance plan, right? But yet he wasn't a viable, believable, sympathetic patient, right? And so I think that story suggests to us that even if everyone has insurance, right, there are some populations, some groups, some constituencies whose bodies we don't care about, whose lives we don't care about, and even if you have luxury insurance, that social fact is an impediment to you getting healthcare access.
Yeah, which it leads to a really important point, I think, that you just got me thinking about, is how the healthcare debate has often erased a population that, in theory, has healthcare. Right. And that's those who are incarcerated. Right. Yeah, sure. And obviously, the notion of there's a doctor, and if one is sick, one will be cared for. Right. But clearly, when we look at the health conditions, when we look at rates of tuberculosis, when we look at the horrific stories about incarcerated women getting mastectomies without proper anesthetics, it points to the differential between access to, whether it be insurance or access to a system, and healthcare that is actually caring, that is actually producing health, which one would think is core to health and care. But there's populations that are getting neither care or something that results in health. And so, yeah, I think that's a really important point in terms of that we've framed it, or it's been framed as access, and the ability to be seen as literally, but not how one is seen, and how we see one's future and one's livelihood and one's humanity. So I think it's a really important point. So tonight you're here in Washington State, and you're going to talk about medical discrimination in relationship to Henrietta Lacks. Many of the students at Washington State are reading that as part of the common reading. So I wonder if you could talk about the relationship between Henrietta Lacks and the work you're doing. And you mentioned a little bit in previous answer, but I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah. So what I do in the talk tonight is to think about Henrietta Lacks intersectionally, sort of think about her as a member of the Black sort of working class, or maybe even the black underclass, right? And also think of her as a woman in 1950. And so what that conjunction tells us are a couple of interesting things. So we know part of what the women's health movement was struggling against was the fact that women had no voice with regard to their medical care. So as late as 1964, 1965, a woman who was married would go to her doctor. The doctor she'd get a diagnosis, but the diagnosis would go to her husband. The woman didn't have a right to get her diagnosis, right? So if we think back 10 years to Henrietta Lacks, who was a black woman without resources and who was married and whose husband's not even sort of respected in a kind of patriarchal sense yet, that he would, such that he would get that information. I mean, she was so profoundly vulnerable, right? And if you think about that 10 years hence, even upper middle class white women would not get their own diagnoses. Right. Think about Henrietta Lacks 10 years back, right? So that's, I think, part of one of the ways that we need to think about it. So there's, I think that, that Skloot is right to be clear that Rebecca Skloot, the author of the Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, that there perhaps weren't technically ethical things that were done wrongly, right? But we can certainly understand where Henrietta Lacks's life, All Too Short Life, kind of fit in this hierarchy of the valuation of life, right? In this moment, and the valuation of information about healthcare and about one's body and agency around healthcare. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, as I'll talk about tonight, in 1951, when Henrietta Lacks's cells are taken without her knowledge and she dies, we're just about to enter the second decade of the Tuskegee syphilis study, right? So a moment in which black people are kind of studied with impunity, right? And left without sort of healthcare resources. And I don't know anything about this doctor who worked on Henrietta Lacks. I mean, I never met him. I don't know what his intentions were. And, I think that we're more sophisticated in talking about racism now. His intentions, in fact, don't have to matter all that much, right? But that this was a system, and, Johns Hopkins Hospital was a place that poor African Americans were afraid of in Baltimore in this time period, right? Precisely because you go in and you don't come out, and that as Lacks did. So, I think we need to think of her, and there's a way to think, because Rebecca's book is so extraordinary. It's so incredibly well written. It's easy to think about it as a one-off kind of singular story, both of tragedy and heroism. If we think about Lacks's immortal cells as sort of doing all this work over time. It's like, it's something out of science fiction.
Right.
It's truly an extraordinary story. But if we put it in the context of institutional racism, classism, sexism, we understand that that there were many other Henrietta Lackses, right, that we don't know about.
Yes. So just finally, kind of switching topics, I'm wondering if you could talk about social media. And clearly this is where our initial connection came about. And so I'm curious how you approach social media, and how your approach connects with people's kind of narrative of social media as the unreal and distraction and not part of the real world.
Well, I'm so glad to have met you that's how we first met, through social media, right? And so I think that it's such a wonderful thing. I mean, I have a department of colleagues that I don't see every day walking down the hall, but I see every day in other ways. And I use the same verb see deliberately. I mean, I hope that we've gotten more sophisticated about virtual and real. I mean, it is different to lay my hand on you, but there's intellectual interchange that kind of happens fairly constantly, and it's been intellectually for me a wonderful community of support and interchange, and to hear people what they're thinking about, and to hear what people are presenting and what they're thinking, how they're thinking through ideas and methods has been thoroughly invaluable. But I also think for me it's given me a different way to read. I mean, it would have been the case that every day I would have read the newspaper or a couple of websites or whatever, but I read now collectively, or I'm thinking about reading things with other people, and it allows me also to sort of process and sort, so I actually have 3 Twitter feeds. I don't know if you know that. So I have one, Alondra, I've got one, The Social Life of DNA, which is about kind of genetics and culture stuff, but it's because, I have lots of friends who don't want to hear anything about genetics. And then I have a new Twitter feed that's called The Double Bind, which comes from a report of women of color scientists in 1975, which is kind of them talking about what it's like to be a woman of color and the scientists and sort of the restrictions that they face, because I'm starting a new project on women of color and technology and science. That'll be my next book, I think. And it just allows me to sort of process information, and those are different networks of people, and those are different kind of conversations, and some of them overlap. I mean, you know, but I think it can be a total time waste, right? I mean, I think if all you're following is, you know, with apologies to all of us who love popular culture, but if you're just following Kim Kardashian and, you know, some basketball wives or what, I mean, you know, then that's what you, it's sort of what you put in is what you get out, right? And so I think if you can follow, you know, Kim Kardashian and, like, you know, 2 Black study scholars and, you know, a couple feminists to balance things out, then I think, you know, you're in good stead. But it can just be purely entertainment.
Well, like anything else.
Yeah.
I mean, I think any, like, if we think about social media, if we think about books, if we think about art, if we think about film, they're all different technologies, and it's about how we use them, and whether we use it to reconstitute a bubble, or whether we use it to expand community. I mean, and so it's interesting that you brought up, you know, it's about who you follow, because I have a Twitter follower who I've actually interviewed as a basketball player, and he consciously only follows, or maybe not only, but he follows a lot of people outside the sports world, specifically professors. And he says that part of it is that in a world of sports, there's a push to maintain the bubble.
Right.
And that social media actually becomes a space of agency where he can create alternative communities that, you know, he might not be able to do because he's on the road, because of the demands of his job. And so I often think that we don't actually reflect on how the level of agency that we have, that whether because of geography, because of class, because of job demands, because of the lack of racial diversity in the communities that we might be living, that it provides a kind of space. And of course, you know, we also can think about how those real life inequalities then manifest online.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's, you know, there's the anthropologist Kath Weston, who writes about queer kinship, uses the title of her really wonderful book is The Families We Choose, right? And I think, you know, one way of thinking about social media, particularly Twitter, is the families you choose, right? So who are the people that you want to learn with, think through, and, you know, and it's, you know, it's, what you're saying is interesting, because we tend to, I think of the real life as the bubble. I mean, actually, we think of the virtual life as the bubble, and the real life is not the bubble. But the story about this, your basketball player colleague is I think instructive. You know, that real life for him is the bubble, and social media becomes the way to sort of
expand
the world,
expand the world.
Family.
Right. He talks about it. We've talked about this on an interview I did, so I can say, hi, David West. That he really was like, I want to know what conversations are going on that often don't get circulated, you know, outside of this space of Twitter. And so, I do think it's interesting. And although we see with social media that we are especially exposed, and I would say Twitter more so than others, to the families we don't choose, because those tweets come and it's like, I didn't ask for your opinion on this. And so in many ways that's also like the real world, that we have exchanges.
But I think it's an interesting skill, right? I mean, to have to, you know, you decide you're going to participate in this it's a public sphere. Right? And that means that somebody who's not in your bubble, the family you choose might, you know, give you a shout out, shout back, and, you know, sometimes it's hazing and it's people who are up to no good. But sometimes it's like, I don't know. Let me think about it. I mean, was I too glib? Was I not careful enough? Should I have said more? And a lot of it is also about just the limits of 140 characters. Like, whew.
But I do think it does challenge you to think about, like, even in that 140 characters, how is someone going to react?
Right.
And really forces us to be as precise as what we mean. Like, hey, you don't have, and I think especially useful for us academics.
Absolutely.
That 1,000-word essay for a popular piece is hard enough.
Right.
But if you're trying to like engage a conversation in 140 characters, I think it's a really important skill. Like, like say it. Just it's like the grad student elevator. Like you need to, your dissertation should be spelled out from floor 1 to floor 3, and now we're to a point where,
unless it's about the Black Panther Party's health activism, and they look at you like you're crazy as you go down.
And then you're like, hold on, depending on who you are, well, now you can say, hey,
exactly.
Follow me on Twitter. You can learn more.
There you go.
Over many days.
There you go.
Well, thank you so much for stopping by today, and we look forward to your talk tonight.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.